There is a photograph taken in 1937 at the opening of the Moscow-Volga Canal. In the original version, 3 men stand together near the water. Joseph Stalin is one of them. Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. The man who at that moment was running what would come to be called the Great Terror is another. The third is a regional official whose name history has largely forgotten, which is, given what happened to the other two, arguably a form of luck. In the version that appeared in official Soviet publications after 1939, the photograph shows 2 men standing near the water. Yezhov is gone. Not gone in the sense of cropped out, the image wasn't simply trimmed at the edges. Gone in the sense of removed. The space where he stood has been filled in with canal bank and shadow. The image was retouched, carefully, by someone whose job it was to make the retouch invisible. And for decades in the textbooks, in the newspapers, in the archives, on the walls of Soviet offices, the canal photograph existed in this form. Stalin at the canal, some water, some reeds. The particular slightly wrong blankness of a space that used to contain a person. This photograph became famous later, when the comparison between the 2 versions became widely known. It became a symbol. It appeared on book covers, in documentaries, in academic papers about propaganda. It became the visual shorthand for an entire system, the Soviet practice of erasing people not just from life, but from the historical record, from photographs, from encyclopedias, from official documents, from memory itself. But here's the thing about symbols. They have a way of making the thing they represent feel exceptional. Dramatic. One-off. A singular act of audacity by a singular regime. The Soviet practice of photo manipulation was not exceptional. It was policy. It was systematic, bureaucratic, ongoing, and in its own perverse way meticulously organized. There were procedures, there were official instructions, there were retouchers who did this as their full-time job, who were good at it, who took professional pride in the seamlessness of the result. There were guidelines for which people needed to be removed, and from which images, and by when. There were follow-up audits to make sure the removals had been completed. The Soviet Union did not stumble into the business of erasing people from photographs. It built an infrastructure for it. This episode is the story of that infrastructure. It is the story of how a government decided that history was not a record of what happened, but a resource, something to be managed, shaped, and when necessary, corrected. It is the story of the specific techniques that were developed to make that correction invisible. It is a story of the people who were erased not just from photographs, but from encyclopedias, from official histories, from the memories of the colleagues who had worked alongside them for decades. And it is the story of what happens to a society when the visible past can no longer be trusted. It is, at its core, a story about a very specific kind of power, because there are many ways to destroy a person. You can imprison them. You can execute them. You can exile them to a labor camp in Siberia where the cold and the work and the starvation will do the job of execution more slowly. These things the Soviet state did, extensively and with terrible efficiency. But the Soviet state did something that most other systems of oppression have not done with comparable thoroughness. It also destroyed the evidence that the person had ever existed. That is a different kind of violence. It is violence directed not at the body, but at the record, and in some ways not instead of, but in addition to it is more total. A body that is destroyed can still be mourned, if the mourners know there is something to mourn. A person who has been removed from every photograph, every document, Every mention in the official record, that person presents their mourners with a different problem. They are not absent in the way that the dead are absent. They are absent in the way that the invented are absent. As though the question of their existence is the question. As though the grief itself requires a justification. George Orwell, writing 1984 and 1948, called this process unpersoning. He did not invent the concept. He observed it. The Soviet Union had been practicing it for more than 2 decades by the time Orwell sat down to write. This is where it started. This is how it worked. And this is why, 70-some years later, the canal photographs Stalin. Ardor and a conspicuous absence is still one of the most unsettling images in the history of political manipulation. Because the blank stretch of canal bank is not empty. It is full of everything that used to be there. To understand why the Soviet Union built a system for erasing people from photographs, you have to understand the relationship that the Soviet project had, from its very beginning, with the question of what was true. This is not a simple relationship. It is not the relationship of a cynical propaganda apparatus that never believed its own output. It is something more complicated, and in some ways more interesting, and ultimately more dangerous. It is the relationship of a movement that believed genuinely, passionately, philosophically that truth was not a fixed thing, but a political thing, that what counted as true depended on whose interests it served, that the apparently objective account of events was always, whether its author knew it or not, an account that served someone's agenda, and that the task of a revolutionary movement was not to pretend otherwise, but to be honest about this fact and to use it consciously, in the service of the correct political goals. This is, to be fair, a more sophisticated position than it might sound. The critique of objectivity as a myth, the argument that all accounts of events are shaped by the perspective, the assumptions, and the interests of the people producing them is not a Soviet invention. It is a legitimate strand of intellectual history that predates Marxism and continues to this day in serious academic discourse. The Soviet contribution was not to invent the skepticism. It was to take the skepticism to a conclusion that most serious intellectual traditions would consider catastrophic. The conclusion that if objective truth is impossible, then truth is whatever power declares it to be. Marxism specifically. Marxist-Leninist theory as it developed in the early Soviet period had a concept for this. It was called partinost, sometimes translated as party-mindedness or party spirit. The concept held that all intellectual and cultural production, art, literature, journalism, history, science should be evaluated not primarily on its accuracy or its aesthetic merit, but on its contribution to the political struggle of the working class as represented by the party. A book that was factually accurate in the bourgeois sense but that served the interests of counter-revolutionary forces was, in this framework, a bad book. A book that contained inaccuracies, a generous word, but that served the correct political line was a better one. You can see where this goes. It does not go there immediately. In the early years of the Soviet experiment, roughly, the period from 1917 to the mid-1920s, there was considerably more tolerance for debate, for artistic experimentation, for the coexistence of competing accounts of events. The party was fighting for its survival against the white armies, against foreign intervention, against famine, against the collapse of the economy. In this context, and the energy of the revolutionary project was channeled outward, against enemies who were real and whose existence was not in dispute. The propaganda apparatus was active. Certainly the Bolsheviks were masters of visual propaganda in a way that most other revolutionary movements have not been, producing remarkable posters, films, theatrical performances, agitprop, but it was directed at mobilizing the population against identifiable external threats. It was not yet primarily directed at rewriting what had already happened. The photographs of the early Soviet period reflect this. They are, by and large, what they appear to be a record of events as they occurred. Lenin at a podium, mass demonstrations, the founding of institutions, the leaders of the party and the state, gathered for formal occasions, arranged for the camera as political figures everywhere arranged themselves for cameras. The early Soviet photographs are propaganda, in the sense that they are presenting a deliberately curated version of events. But they are propaganda in a mode that most modern states would recognize: the selection of flattering angles, the exclusion of unflattering moments, the staging of images to communicate specific messages. They are not yet, for the most part, the systematic fabrication of the historical record. The shift begins with Lenin's illness and death. Vladimir Lenin suffered his first major stroke in May 1922. He was 51 years old. He had led the Bolshevik Party through the revolution, through the Civil War, through the disastrous experiment with war communism, and the pragmatic retreat of the new economic policy. He was, by any measure, the central figure of the Soviet project, its founder, its ideologist, its public face, and beginning in 1922, he was visibly, undeniably failing. This presented the Soviet propaganda apparatus with its first serious problem of image management. The problem was not simply aesthetic, not simply the question of how to photograph a man who was increasingly incapacitated in ways that an official photograph would make visible. The problem was political and urgent, and had a dimension that the leadership recognized immediately. Whoever controlled the narrative of Lenin's decline controlled the narrative of succession. The question of who would lead the Soviet Union after Lenin was, by 1922, the most consequential political question in the country. And it was being fought out partially, not exclusively, but significantly through control of information. Who was closest to Lenin? Who had Lenin's confidence? Who was authorized to interpret Lenin's wishes? Who Lenin had endorsed, or criticized, or expressed concern about? It was in this context that Joseph Stalin, at the time the General Secretary of the Communist Party, a relatively bureaucratic position that he had used with extraordinary skill to build a network of loyal apparatchiks throughout the party structure, began the long process of image management that would eventually become, under his leadership, the systematic rewriting of history. Stalin was not, in 1922, the dominant figure in Soviet politics. He was one of several leaders competing for position and influence. His competitors included men of considerably greater intellectual distinction and public profile. Leon Trotsky, the founder and commander of the Red Army, a brilliant orator and writer, Grigory Zinoviev, the head of the Communist International, Lev Kamenev, the chairman of the Moscow Soviet, Nikolai Bukharin, the party's chief theorist. These were men with strong personalities, large followings, and vivid public presences. They were also, most of them, considerably better at the things that people in 1922 would have said mattered: the ideological debate, the theoretical writing, the oratory at congresses. Stalin was better at something else. He was better at the machinery of the state. He was better at appointments and personnel files, and knowing who owed what to whom. He was better at patience, the particular, cold patience of a man who is not primarily interested in winning this argument, but in positioning himself to decide which arguments happen at all. One of the things Stalin understood earlier, perhaps, than most of his contemporaries, was the political significance of photographs. In the early 1920s, Photographs were not yet the ubiquitous medium they would become. The Soviet Union was a predominantly rural, largely illiterate country. For a vast portion of the population, photographs, official photographs, photographs in state publications, photographs on display in public buildings were a primary interface with the leadership they would never meet in person. A photograph of Lenin and Stalin together, prominently placed, communicated something specific and important to an audience that might not be able to read. These two men are associated. These two men share something. This man here, this Stalin, is part of the same thing as Lenin. This man is legitimate. This is why the specific photograph taken in May 1922 at Lenin's dacha at Gorky matters so much. It shows Lenin and Stalin together, in apparent intimacy, Lenin seated, Stalin standing nearby. The image of collegial closeness. The photograph was widely reproduced in Soviet publications. It was used explicitly and deliberately as evidence of the closeness of the two men's relationship. Stalin's associates ensured it circulated. It was, in the early management of the succession question, one of the most politically significant images in the Soviet Union. There is a complication. Lenin, in the final months of his life, was not close to Stalin. He was, in fact, deeply concerned about Stalin. In a document that became known as Lenin's Testament dictated to his secretaries in December 1922 and January 1923, Lenin wrote a series of evaluations of the major Soviet leaders. His evaluation of Stalin was damning. He wrote that Stalin had concentrated enormous power in his hands, and that he was not always capable of using that power with sufficient caution. In a postscript added in January 1923, he was more direct. He recommended that Stalin be removed from the position of General Secretary. He described him as too rude and said that this rudeness, which might be tolerable in relations among communists, was unacceptable in the General Secretary. This document, Lenin's formal, written, dictated assessment that Stalin should be removed from his position, was suppressed after Lenin's death in January 1924. The Politburo, by a majority that included Zinoviev and Kamenev, voted not to read it to the party congress as Lenin had intended. The vote was close. The suppression was not total. The document circulated in restricted form and was known to the party leadership, but it was kept from the wider party membership, and it was kept from the public, and it did not, at that moment, destroy Stalin's position. The suppression of Lenin's testament was the first major act of the Soviet state in the business of managing historical memory. It was not a photograph that was altered. It was a document that was hidden. But the principle was the same. The official record was adjusted to remove information that was politically inconvenient for the people doing the adjusting. This is the origin point, not the airbrush, not the retouching. The decision made in the spring of 1924 by the collective leadership of the Soviet Union that the historical record could be managed in the interests of political stability. That inconvenient truth was something to be controlled, not simply reported. From here, the story moves quickly. Lenin's death created the space for the succession struggle that Lenin had, in his testament, tried to prevent. The struggle lasted roughly from 1924 to 1929, and it was, by any measure, one of the most consequential internal power struggles of the 20th century. At stake was the direction of the world's first communist state, a direction that would ultimately determine the character of Soviet governance for the next 6 decades, and the character of communist movements worldwide for even longer. The details of the struggle, the shifting alliances, the ideological disputes, the personal vendettas, the procedural maneuvers, by which Stalin outmaneuvered each of his rivals in turn, are a story for another episode. And a long one. What matters for this episode is the role that image management played in the struggle, and the precedents it set for what was to come. Stalin's opponents in the succession struggle were, almost all of them, people with longer revolutionary histories, greater intellectual prestige, and more visible public profiles than Stalin himself. Trotsky had led the Red Army. Zinoviev had run the Communist International. Bukharin was the party's most respected theorist. Against these credentials, Stalin's claim to Lenin's legacy was partly biographical. He had indeed been a loyal Bolshevik revolutionary, but partly manufactured. The manufacturing took specific forms. First, there was the cult of Lenin. In the weeks after Lenin's death, Stalin delivered a funeral oration that was, in both its content and its rhetorical structure, a masterpiece of self-positioning. He presented himself as Lenin's most faithful disciple. He organized the preservation of Lenin's body and the construction of the mausoleum on Red Square. He associated himself, at every possible opportunity, with Lenin's image, Lenin's words, Lenin's legacy. The discipline of Leninism, the systematic study and application of Lenin's thought, was, in its Soviet institutional form, largely a Stalin construction, and the primary interpreter of Leninism was, conveniently, Stalin. Second, there was the management of the photographic record. The photographs of the revolutionary period, the period from 1917 to 1924, contained a problem. They were accurate. They showed what had actually happened. And what had actually happened included an enormous amount of Trotsky organizing the Red Army, Trotsky at the platform during the revolution, Trotsky alongside Lenin at major events. The photographic record of the revolution was, in significant measure, a photographic record of Trotsky's centrality to it. This was a problem. If Stalin's claim to power rested partly on being Lenin's closest colleague and most faithful disciple, and then the visible prominence of Trotsky in the photographic record of the period they were both supposed to have shared with Lenin was an inconvenient visual argument. It said, these two men were both there, and this one was more prominent than you're now being told. The response to this problem was not immediate. In the mid-1920s, as Stalin was still consolidating power, the manipulation of photographs was more selective, a matter of choosing which photographs to publish and which to archive, rather than systematically altering the images themselves. But the direction of travel was established. The photographs that showed Trotsky prominently near Lenin began to be less prominently featured. The photographs that showed Stalin near Lenin began to be more prominently featured. The visual construction of the Lenin-Stalin relationship, the relationship that the Gorky photograph had been used to establish, intensified, and then Trotsky was expelled from the party in 1927, exiled from the Soviet Union in 1929, and the selective management of the photographic record became something more systematic. That is a specific anecdote that captures the transition precisely. A Soviet official named Grigory Goldenberg, a relatively minor figure in the bureaucratic hierarchy, was photographed at a party event in the mid-1920s in a group that included several more prominent figures. After one of those figures was purged, the photograph was sent to a retoucher for editing. Goldenberg, who was not himself purged, reported that when the retouched version came back, the purged figure had been removed, but so, incidentally, after the retoucher, apparently uncertain about the status of everyone in the photograph, had removed any figure who might become a problem. Better, it seems, to err on the side of too much erasure than too little. This anecdote, which appears in David King's exhaustive visual history of Soviet photo manipulation, The Commissar Vanishes, tells you something important about the atmosphere in which the practice developed. It was not only Stalin who was managing the photographs, it was a bureaucratic apparatus, operating under instructions, exercising discretion, making judgment calls about who needed to be removed and who could safely remain. The erasure of inconvenient people from the photographic record became, at some point in the late 1920s, a job, with people who did it, with standards for how well it should be done, with a logic, if you can call it that was bureaucratic as much as political. Stalin did not sit in a room with an airbrush, personally erasing his enemies from photographs. He did not need to. He built a system that did it for him, and then he used that system to rewrite the revolution. Let's talk about how you erase a person from a photograph. In the 1930s, before the digital tools that have made this kind of manipulation trivially easy, the process was genuinely skilled work. It required patience, a steady hand, and a particular kind of professional detachment, the ability to look at a human face and treat it as a technical problem rather than a person. The primary tool was the airbrush, a small, pen-like device that uses compressed air to spray ink or paint in a fine, controllable mist. The airbrush had been developed in the late 19th century as an artistic tool, and by the 1930s, it was widely used in commercial illustration, advertising, and photography, retouching. It was in the hands of a skilled operator, capable of extraordinary subtlety. You could use it to smooth skin tones, remove blemishes, adjust shadows. You could use it to add things to a photograph, a cleaner sky, a more flattering background. And you could use it to remove things, a telephone wire crossing a landscape, an unwanted object in the frame, a person who was no longer supposed to be there. The process for removing a person from a Soviet official photograph typically involved several stages. First, the photograph, usually a large format print made from the original glass plate or film negative, would be examined to determine the complexity of the removal. A person standing at the edge of a group, against a plain background, was relatively straightforward. A person standing in the center of a group, partially overlapping with other figures who were to remain, was considerably more difficult. The retoucher needed to reconstruct the background behind the removed figure to paint in, convincingly, the wall, the curtain, the crowd, the landscape that the figure's body had been covering. Second, the figure would be carefully masked, surrounded with a precise line that preserved all the surrounding elements that were to remain, and isolated the elements to be removed. This was done with a fine brush and a steady hand, sometimes under magnification. Third, the airbrush work itself, building up layers of paint or photographic dye over the figure, matching the tones and textures of the surrounding area, extending background elements across the space the figure had occupied. This was the skilled part. A retoucher who was good at this, and some were very good, could produce a result that was invisible to casual inspection. A retoucher who was less good, or who was working under time pressure, produced results that are visible to modern eyes as the slightly wrong zones that mark Soviet official photographs at their most manipulated, areas where the texture of a background is subtly inconsistent, where shadows don't quite fall correctly, where the spatial logic of the image doesn't fully cohere. Fourth, and the retouched print would be photographed again to produce a new negative, effectively laundering the manipulation through a photographic process, so that the output was a photograph, not a painting, and carried the apparent authority of photographic truth. This is the physical process. It is, in retrospect, both more laborious and more impressive than we might imagine when we think of photo manipulation in the era of Photoshop. These were craftspeople. They were doing difficult work, under pressure, to deadlines, for clients who were, in several cases, the most powerful and dangerous people in the world, and they were doing it at industrial scale. David King, the British art director and researcher who spent 30 years collecting Soviet propaganda materials and produced the definitive visual record of Soviet photo manipulation, estimated that he had personally examined thousands of photographs from the Soviet period that showed evidence of retouching, of faces painted out, figures removed, backgrounds reconstructed, thousands, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of individual acts of manipulation, spread across decades, covering the entire sweep of Soviet public visual culture from the mid-1920s onward. This is not the work of a single obsessive leader personally curating his own image. This is an institution. This is a workforce. This is a policy. Now, who are the people being erased? And why? The answer to why is, in retrospect, almost comically straightforward. You were erased from the photographic record when you were purged from the political record. The two processes moved in lockstep. When the party decided you were an enemy of the people, a wrecker, un saboteur, un trotskiste, a fasciste spu, or any of the other categories of political villain that Soviet political culture produced in extraordinary abundance during the 1930s, it did not simply arrest you. It unmade you. Your arrest was followed by your disappearance from official records. Your name was removed from publications. Your contributions were uncredited or reassigned. And your face was removed from photographs. The most famous case, the one that, more than any other, has come to stand for the entire practice, is Leon Trotsky. Trotsky's erasure from the Soviet photographic record is one of the most extensive acts of visual revisionism in the history of political propaganda. And it is extensive because Trotsky had, in fact, been enormously important not just to the party, not just to the revolution, but to the specific moments that the party most wanted to commemorate. The October Revolution, the Civil War, the founding of the Red Army. These were not events that had happened somewhere while Trotsky was in a back office. He had been central to them, publicly and visibly and with the documentation to prove it, which meant that erasing him required erasing him from precisely the photographs that the Soviet state most wanted to keep, the iconic images of its own founding moments. The most discussed example involves a series of photographs taken in May 1920, when Lenin gave a famous speech to Red Army troops departing for the Polish front. Lenin spoke from a platform. Trotsky and Kamenev were present. Standing on the steps of the platform, clearly visible in the photographs, the image was widely reproduced in the Soviet period as an iconic moment, Lenin inspiring the troops. After Trotsky's expulsion from the party and exile in 1929, and after Kamenev's own fall from favor and eventual execution in 1936, the photograph required attention. In the most common retouched version, the steps beside the platform are empty. Lenin speaks to an empty flight of stairs. The two men who were visibly there, who anyone who had seen the original could tell you were there, have been replaced by boards and shadows. This retouched version appeared in official Soviet publications for decades. It appeared in textbooks. It appeared in photographic retrospectives of the revolution. It was, for the Soviet citizen, looking at an authorized history of their own country, the image of what had happened in May 1920. The logical implication, which every Soviet citizen who had any access to any pre-manipulation version of the photograph had to navigate privately, was not comfortable. Either the photograph was accurate, which meant two prominent figures had been removed and the official history was false, or the original was somehow mistaken, which required a different kind of mental gymnastics, or you simply didn't look too hard, which was the option that carried the lowest risk. This third option, the deliberate cultivation of what the historian Orlando Figes calls a conspiracy of silence, in which large numbers of people privately know something that no one is permitted to say publicly, is one of the more devastating social consequences of the Soviet practice of historical falsification. It did not, in most cases, produce a population of convinced believers. It produced something arguably worse, a population that had learned to distrust its own perception, a population that had been trained through years of exposure to photographs that they half knew were manipulated, encyclopedias that they half knew had been updated to remove inconvenient entries, histories that they half knew had been edited, trained to hold their own knowledge at arm's length, to not quite trust what they thought they remembered, to keep the knowledge of falsification private, because the costs of making it public were potentially fatal. We'll return to this social dimension. First, let's complete the gallery. After Trotsky, the next major category of erasure involved the figures who lost the succession struggle in stages, the so-called left opposition, the right opposition, and everyone else who, at some point in the 1930s, found themselves on the wrong side of Stalin's increasingly paranoid political calculus. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev were two of Stalin's original allies in the struggle against Trotsky. They formed the Troika Stalin. Zinoviev, Kamenev that dominated Soviet politics from Lenin's death through the mid-1920s. They then broke with Stalin, allied with Trotsky, lost, capitulated, were reinstated, were purged again, capitulated again, were reinstated again, and were finally arrested in 1934 following the assassination of Sergei Kirov, an event that Stalin used as the trigger for the Great Terror, and that many historians believe Stalin may himself have arranged or at least facilitated. Zinoviev and Kamenev were subjected to the first of the major show trials of the 1930s, convicted of crimes they had not committed, on the basis of confessions extracted under torture and psychological pressure, and executed in August 1936. Their removal from the official photographic record had been ongoing before their execution. The process of erasure tracked the process of political discrediting, not just the final biological disposal. By the time they were shot, many of the photographs in which they had appeared had already been adjusted, their faces painted out, their figures replaced with wall or crowd or sky. The execution was, in the visual record, an afterthought. The disappearance had already happened. Nikolai Bukharin, the party's chief theorist, the man Lenin had called the darling of the party, the author of foundational Bolshevik texts, was arrested in 1937 and executed in 1938. At the end of a show trial in which he delivered a confession that was partly genuine, he did believe the charges required a public defense of the party's right to eliminate opponents. Partly coerced and entirely staged, his face was removed from photographs. His name was removed from publications. His theoretical contributions were either ignored or attributed to others. He was, in the official record, Unmade. And then there is the case of Nikolai Yezhov, the man from the canal photograph, the man whose absence from that particular image opened this episode, which is, in its way, the most satisfying case for understanding the full perversity of the system. Because Yezhov was not a victim of the purges. He was their primary administrator. He was the man who ran them. And then the purges consumed him too. Yezhov was appointed head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, in September 1936. He was 39 years old. Short, physically unimpressive. The kind of man who, in other circumstances, might have lived and died without particular note. Stalin called him my Nikolai and my little iron commissar. The period of his tenure, September 1936 to November 1000. 938 became known, in a sardonic acknowledgement of its primary architect, as the Yezhovshchina, the Yezhov era, the era of the Great Terror. The numbers are almost impossible to fully process. During the Yezhovshchina, the NKVD arrested approximately 1.5 million people. Of those, approximately 750,000 were shot. The rest were sent to the Gulag, the network of forced labor camps spread across the Soviet Union, particularly in Siberia and the Arctic, where conditions were designed to slowly extract labor from a body while gradually destroying it. Of those sent to the Gulag during this period, a substantial number died before their sentences ended. The total death toll directly attributable to Yezhov's administration of the terror through executions and camp deaths is estimated at somewhere between 750,000 and 2 million people over approximately 27 months. That is a killing rate that, during the peak months of the terror in 1937 to 1938, exceeded 1,000 executions per day. Yezhov did not commit these killings personally. He oversaw an apparatus. He signed lists, death lists, arrest orders for operations. The apparatus executed the orders, but the orders were Yezhov's, within limits set by Stalin, and the scale of the killing was, in significant measure, a product of Yezhov's particular combination of organizational efficiency, personal sadism, and desperate need to satisfy a superior whose appetite for enemies seemed, in this period, to be without limit. Stalin seems to have decided, at some point in late 1938, that the terror had gone far enough, or rather, had gone in directions that were becoming counterproductive. The mass arrests had consumed a significant portion of the Red Army's officer corps, which would become catastrophically relevant when Germany invaded in 1941. They had consumed experienced economic managers and technicians at a time when the economy needed them, and they had consumed, in ever-expanding circles, party officials, factory managers, engineers, scientists, writers, doctors, replaced, where they were replaced at all, with less experienced, more frightened successors who had learned that the safest course of action was to do exactly what they were told and nothing else. Stalin pulled back. He did it by the method he had developed for pulling back from previous policy disasters. He blamed the instrument, Yezhov, who had been presented to the Soviet public as a hero of socialist vigilance, began to be discussed in internal party channels as someone who had gone too far, who had allowed mistakes to happen, who had arrested people who were innocent. This was, to put it gently, a remarkable exercise in responsibility laundering. Given that Yezhov's every major action had been personally approved by Stalin, Yezhov was removed from his position in November 1938. His successor was Lavrentiy Beria, who would run the NKVD for the next 15 years with somewhat greater efficiency and somewhat more targeted cruelty, a connoisseur's approach to state violence, as opposed to Yezhov's blunter mass production model. Yezhov was arrested in April 1939, tried in secret, and shot in February 1940. His last words, reportedly, was spent protesting his loyalty to Stalin. Whether he believed this to the end, or whether it was simply the only available script in a system that had no other language, is impossible to know. What happened to his image in the photographic record is precisely what he had spent 3 years arranging to happen to the images of his victims. He was removed. The canal photograph is the most famous example, but it was not the only one. Photographs of Yezhov with Stalin, with other officials, at official events wherever he had appeared in an image that was held in official archives or published in official publications. Retouchers went to work. His face was painted out. His figure was replaced. In some cases, the removal was done hastily and the result is visible. The proportions of the group are slightly wrong. The spacing between figures doesn't quite make sense. There is a background element that doesn't flow naturally from one side of the image to the other. In the canal photograph, the work is better. The reeds in water that replaced Yezhov's figure are relatively convincing. You have to know to look for the wrongness. The lighting on the reconstructed background matches the lighting on the figure still present. The horizon line is consistent. Someone did a good job. Someone took professional pride in making Nikolai Yezhov, who had killed 750 people, disappear as completely as if he had never been there. The irony is almost too neat. The man who had run the machinery of disappearance, the interrogations, the confessions, the executions, the careful removal of people from the functioning world was processed by that same machinery. The retouchers who painted him out of the canal photograph were, in a sense, completing the same operation that his own apparatus had been completing on his victims for 3 years. First the arrest, then the execution, then the removal of the evidence that the person had ever existed. Except that Yezhov, unlike most of his victims, had personally overseen the photographic erasure of dozens of his colleagues. He had seen how the system worked. He had been, in some operational sense, the client who sent the photographs for retouching, and then he became the subject. There's a word for this in Russian, zerkalo, which means mirror. The Soviet system was, in this respect, a very good mirror. What you did to others, it eventually showed you doing to yourself. Now let's talk about the mechanics, more precisely, because the specifics matter for understanding why this practice was not simply the vanity project of a paranoid dictator, but a coherent, if utterly monstrous political technology. The removal of a person from the photographic record served several simultaneous functions. The first was the function it most obviously appears to serve. It removed visual evidence of the person's former prominence and association with the leadership. A photograph of Trotsky with Lenin, if widely reproduced, it was a constant visual argument that Trotsky had been important. Removing Trotsky from the photograph did not remove the fact of his importance from the memory of people who had lived through the period, but it removed the easy, public, reproducible evidence. It made the claim of his importance more like a personal memory, which could be dismissed as subjective, and less like a document, which demands engagement. The second function was what historians have called the function of legitimation replacement. When a person was removed from a photograph, the space they had occupied didn't just become empty. The retouched image, circulated as the official version, told a different story. The Lenin platform photograph, with the empty steps, told the story of Lenin speaking to the troops, and implicitly, of Lenin alone, or Lenin with the anonymous collective of the party. Without the embarrassing specificity of other named leaders whose prominence the photograph documented, the manipulation was not just subtraction, it was replacement of one narrative with another. The third function was social and psychological, and in some ways the most interesting. The existence of manipulated photographs in the official record photographs that a significant portion of the population half knew to be manipulated produced a specific kind of cognitive environment. It produced an environment in which the official account and private knowledge were systematically in tension, and in which private knowledge had to be suppressed. The person who looked at the empty steps in the Lenin platform photograph and thought I know Trotsky stood there had two options. They could say so publicly, which was dangerous in proportion to the specificity and the audience. Or they could not say so, which required a small act of self-suppression. The conscious decision to hold your own knowledge at arm's length from your public speech. Repeat that act often enough, across enough domains, for long enough, and it becomes a habit. And a population with the habit of suppressing what it privately knows in favor of what it is publicly required to say is a population that is very difficult to organize politically around the question of truth. Because every act of resistance to the official story requires first admitting to yourself that you have been performing a lie. And that admission is uncomfortable in proportion to how long and how completely you have been performing it. This is, I think, one of the most underappreciated aspects of the Soviet falsification project. It was not primarily aimed at convincing people. It was primarily aimed at silencing them. The goal was not a population of true believers who genuinely thought the Lenin platform steps were always empty. The goal was a population that knew the steps weren't always empty and had learned, through years of practice, not to say so. The falsification of the photographic record was not a project of persuasion. It was a project of complicity. It turned the entire Soviet population into participants in the lie, because every person who looked at a manipulated photograph and said nothing, filed it away and moved on, participated in the maintenance of the fiction. This is a very efficient form of social control. It requires no surveillance of private thought, only the management of public speech. And the management of public speech in the Soviet Union was backed by penalties so severe that most people's calculation was, rationally, to perform the required complicity as a simple matter of survival. We should pause here to talk about the people at the bottom of this system, not Stalin, not the Yezhov, not the political figures whose careers and lives were destroyed, but the retouchers themselves. The craftspeople who actually painted out the faces. We know almost nothing about them individually. The work of photo retouching in the Soviet Union was not work that was advertised, credited, or discussed. Retouchers were not asked to sign their work. They worked within institutions, publishing houses, newspapers, the State Photo Archive known as TASS, and the instructions they received were, at most, bureaucratic rather than explicitly political. Edit this photograph to remove the figure indicated. That would have been, in most cases, the full extent of the instruction. The retoucher was not told why the figure was being removed. They were told that it needed to be removed. And they did their job. Some of them, undoubtedly, knew exactly what they were doing and why. The political context of any given removal was usually not difficult to deduce, especially as the years went on and the list of figures being removed tracked the list of figures being arrested and executed. If you were a retoucher at a Soviet publishing house in 1937 to 1938, and you were receiving instructions to remove, in rapid succession, the faces of people whose names you had been reading about in arrest reports, in the same newspapers you worked for. You were not confused about the political significance of your work. But what choice did they have? Refusing to do the work was not, in the Soviet Union of the Great Terror, a realistic option. It was a potentially fatal one. The retoucher who said, "I don't think I should be removing this person from this photograph," was, in the political atmosphere of 1937, doing something that could be construed as sympathy for an enemy of the people, which was itself a crime, which was itself grounds for arrest. So they did the work. They did it carefully. And well, because doing it poorly also had potential consequences. Sloppy retouching that left visible traces of the removed figure could be interpreted as deliberate sabotage, which was also a crime. The incentive structure was clear. Do the work. Do it well. Don't ask questions. Survive. This is the ordinary human infrastructure of an extraordinary crime. Not monsters. Mostly people doing a job that they had not chosen. under conditions that made refusal fatal. The retouchers of the Soviet Union are a specific instance of a general human phenomenon that Hannah Arendt would later analyze in a different context. The way that large-scale atrocity is typically carried out, not by unusual people with unusual capacities for evil, but by ordinary people functioning within institutional structures that make ordinary behavior serve extraordinary ends. The airbrush was just a tool. The person holding it was just a craftsperson. The crime was in the structure. Let's end this chapter with 3 images, a triptych of the practice at its most revealing. The first is a photograph taken in the early 1920s, showing a group of Soviet officials at a conference. In the original, the group includes 11 people. In the version published in a Soviet retrospective in the late 1930s, the group includes 7. 4 people have been removed. 2 of the 4 were executed during the Great Terror. 1 died in a labor camp. 1 was exiled. The 4 empty spaces in the retouched photograph are not marked, not explained, not acknowledged. They are simply not there. The second is a photograph of Stalin, Yezhov, and other officials taken at the Tushino Air Show in 1937, a major Soviet public event. Widely photographed. In the original, Yezhov is visible, smiling, clearly in a position of prominence beside Stalin. In the retouched version published after Yezhov's arrest, the space beside Stalin is occupied by a different figure, not a void, but an actual replacement. Another official who had not been at the original event has been, in some versions, painted in to fill the gap. The falsification is not just subtractive but additive, not just removing what was there, adding what wasn't. The third is not a photograph of a person at all. It is a photograph of a city, Leningrad, taken in the early 1930s. And in the background of the image, visible on the side of a building, is a large official portrait of Zinoviev, who had been the city's long-time leader before his fall from power. In the retouched version, the building's wall is clean. The portrait, the monument to the city's history that a real person had occupied, has been painted over. The city itself, in the official photographic record, was made to forget who had governed it. The city did not forget. People remembered, but the photograph said otherwise. In the Soviet Union of the 1930s, the photographs had an authority that individual memory could not match. The airbrush was the visible edge of something much larger. What the Soviet state did to photographs was dramatic, and it has captured the historical imagination precisely because photographs are such direct, visceral evidence. You can see the manipulation, once you know to look for it, in a way that makes the lie undeniable. But the falsification of the photographic record was, in the larger architecture of Soviet historical management, a relatively small operation. It was the cosmetic layer. The foundation was something more comprehensive, more bureaucratic, and in its own way more audacious. The systematic rewriting of the written record. Books, encyclopedias, newspapers, academic journals, official histories, textbooks, party documents, the entire apparatus of written knowledge that a literate society uses to transmit the past to the present, all of it was subject, in the Soviet Union of the Stalin era, to ongoing revision. Not revision in the normal sense of scholarly correction, the updating of knowledge as new evidence emerges, the refining of interpretation as understanding deepens, revision in the political sense, and the changing of what the record said to match what the party currently required it to say, regardless of what had actually happened. To understand the scale of this, you need to understand something about the Soviet relationship to official knowledge. In most societies, Knowledge is produced by a distributed network of institutions, universities, publishing houses, newspapers, research organizations that operate with varying degrees of independence from the state. The state may attempt to influence this production, and in many cases succeeds in influencing it significantly. But the distribution of the knowledge production system means that the influence is partial, contested, and subject to pushback. A government that tries to change what the history books say has to contend with historians who disagree. A government that tries to suppress a finding has to contend with the possibility that the finding will be published elsewhere, by someone else, in a venue it doesn't control. The Soviet Union had, by the late 1920s, eliminated most of the structural features that make this kind of resistance possible. Publishing was state-controlled. Universities were state institutions. The press was a state instrument. There was no independent academy, no independent press, no independent intellectual community of any significance outside the structures of the party and the state. The knowledge production system was, by design and by law, a single unified instrument under central control. This had obvious advantages from the perspective of a government that wanted to manage what people knew. It meant that when the party decided that the historical record needed to be adjusted, that a person needed to be removed, a date changed, an event reinterpreted, a cause reassigned, the adjustment could be made simultaneously across the entire knowledge production system. Not just in one encyclopedia, but in all of them. Not just in one history textbook, but in all history textbooks. Not just in one newspaper archive, but in every newspaper archive in the country. The efficiency of this is considered as a purely technical achievement. Remarkable. The Soviet state could update the official version of events with a thoroughness that no decentralized system could match. When they decided that Trotsky had not helped found the Red Army, they could ensure that this was the version that appeared in every source a Soviet citizen might consult. Not most sources. Every source. Because they controlled every source. The document that best illustrates this process and that best illustrates the breathtaking audacity of what the Soviet state was attempting is a letter in 1954. A letter arrived at the home of a subscriber to the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, the official Soviet reference work, modeled on the great encyclopedias of the 19th century, and published in multiple volumes over several decades. The subscriber had received their volumes as expected. The letter informed them that the enclosed pages were replacement pages for their encyclopedia, and that they should use the enclosed razor blade to remove the current pages and insert the replacements. The current pages contained an entry on Lavrenti Beria, the longtime head of the NKVD who had been arrested and executed in 1953, following Stalin's death. After a brief and spectacularly unsuccessful attempt to leverage his control of the security apparatus into political succession, Beria had been convicted of treason, espionage, and a variety of other charges in a trial that was, by the standards of Soviet justice, conducted with notable speed. He was shot in December 1953. The replacement pages contained an expanded entry on the Bering Sea. This is, in miniature, the entire Soviet approach to historical memory. A man who had run the Soviet secret police for 15 years, who had been one of the most powerful figures in the Soviet state, whose name had appeared in countless official publications, encyclopedias, histories, and commemorations. This man was to be replaced, in the official record, by information about a body of water. The subscriber was being asked not simply to update their reference material, but to physically participate in the act of erasure, to use their own hands, with the provided razor blade, to cut out the record of Beria's existence and replace it with geography. Most subscribers complied. Of course they did. This was not a request. It was an instruction from the state. And in the Soviet Union of 1954, even post-Stalin, even in the relative loosening of the early Khrushchev period, the habit of complying with instructions from the state was deeply, structurally ingrained. The subscribers cut out the pages. They inserted the replacements. In homes and offices and libraries across the Soviet Union, Lavrenti Beria was replaced by the Bering Sea. And here is the thing that makes this anecdote more than just a darkly comic footnote. The Beria letter was not an innovation. It was the application of an established practice to a specific high-profile case. The great Soviet Encyclopedia had been sending replacement pages to its subscribers since at least the late 1930s. The practice was routine. Subscribers who had been receiving the encyclopedia over the years had already been asked to replace pages containing entries on Zinoviev, on Kamenev, on Tukhachevsky, on any number of people whose political status had changed since their entries were written. The razor blade and the replacement page were, for a committed Soviet encyclopedia subscriber, a familiar experience, a periodic reminder that knowledge was not fixed, that the past was subject to ongoing revision, that what you knew today might need to be updated tomorrow. The extraordinary thing is that most people apparently did it without visible protest. They cut out the pages. They put in the replacements. They continued subscribing. This is not a mystery. The risks of not complying were real. And the habit of compliance had been built over years. But it tells you something important about the social environment that the falsification project had created by the late Stalin period. The revision of official knowledge was not experienced by the Soviet population as a shocking event. It was experienced as a normal feature of official life, something that happened, something you dealt with, something you performed, quietly, in your own home, with a razor blade provided by the state. The encyclopedia replacement pages are the most tangible evidence of this normalization. But they were not the only one. Consider what the systematic revision of official knowledge meant for specific intellectual communities. Historians, obviously, were in the most directly exposed position. Soviet historians, the people whose professional function was to research and interpret the past, were required to work within a political framework that changed faster than scholarship could track. A Soviet historian who had published a well-regarded study of the Russian Civil War in 1928, crediting Trotsky's role in founding the Red Army, found themselves in possession of a professional liability by 1930. Not just a politically inconvenient text, but a dangerous one, a published record of having said something that was now, officially, false. The practical response, for most Soviet historians, was a combination of self-censorship, regular revision of published positions to match current party requirements, and the gradual development of a scholarly style that prioritized political safety over analytical precision. Soviet historical writing of the Stalin era has a characteristic quality that specialists in the field can identify on sight. It is strangely airless. The arguments are present, but the conclusions are predetermined. The evidence is marshaled, but toward ends that are already established. It is the writing of people who know, before they begin, what they are required to find. Scientists were, in some respects, even worse off, because the revision of official knowledge was not limited to the human sciences. The Stalin era produced one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of scientific fraud, the Lysenko affair. Trofim Lysenko was an agronomist, a plant scientist who rose to prominence in the Soviet Union in the 1930s on the basis of claims that were, from the perspective of mainstream biology, simply false. Lysenko rejected the Mendelian genetics that had been the foundation of biological science since the late 19th century, arguing that it was ideologically contaminated bourgeois, idealist, incompatible with the materialist basis of Marxist science. He promoted instead a theory of vernalization, the idea that plants could be conditioned to change their hereditary characteristics through environmental modification, and that these changes could be inherited by subsequent generations. This is, in biological terms, Lamarckism, a theory that modern genetics had definitively refuted. It is wrong. It was wrong then. It is wrong now. And the scientific community of the 1930s largely understood it to be wrong. Lysenko, however, had powerful patrons, including Stalin, and his theories had strong ideological appeal because they suggested that environment, not heredity, determined biological character. This was, in the Soviet ideological framework, a very attractive idea. It implied that human beings, like plants, could be remade by changing their conditions. It implied that the Soviet project of creating a new Soviet man had a biological foundation. It was congenial to Marxist determinism in a way that the genetic lottery of Mendel simply was not. The consequences for Soviet biology were devastating. Mendelian genetics was officially denounced as pseudoscience. Geneticists who refused to accept Lysenko's theories were dismissed from their positions, stripped of their academic titles, arrested. Some were shot. The teaching of genetics in Soviet universities was effectively shut down for decades. The Soviet agricultural program, already struggling with the consequences of collectivization, which had killed millions of people, lost access to the scientific tools it needed to improve crop yields. Because the science was officially wrong. The Lysenko affair is relevant here because it illustrates something important. The Soviet project of managing official knowledge was not limited to political history. It extended to natural science. It extended to any domain of knowledge where the party determined that the officially correct answer differed from the actually correct one. In the Soviet Union of the Stalin era, truth was not a fixed property of accurate description. It was a political determination, and the political determination could, and did, override the actually correct answer in any domain the party chose to enter. This is a more radical claim than it might appear. Most authoritarian governments lie about political history. Many lie about economic performance. Some lie about military capabilities. The Soviet Union under Stalin was willing to make officially mandated truth claims in biology. In physics, there were Stalinist interventions in chemistry, in linguistics, in music theory, in virtually every domain of human knowledge. The universality of the project was its defining feature. It was not targeted propaganda about specific inconvenient facts. It was a comprehensive claim to the right to determine what was true in every domain, at every time. Now, let's talk about the document that represents the most ambitious single act in this comprehensive project, the book that Stalin wrote, personally edited, and deployed as the official history of his own rise to power. In 1938, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union published a short book approximately 350 pages in most editions, titled History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Bolsheviks, Short Course. It was officially attributed to a commission of the Central Committee. But it was, in practice, a book that Stalin had personally written significant portions of and personally edited throughout. The evidence for this is extensive. Stalin's handwritten corrections on draft manuscripts have been recovered from Soviet archives and analyzed by historians. He did not simply approve the book. He wrote it. He shaped it. He decided, word by word, what the official history of the party would say. What the book said was, by any independent historical measure, a work of fiction. Not fiction in every detail. Many of the basic facts about the party's history were accurately represented, but the interpretive framework, the assignment of credit, and blame. The characterization of individuals, the account of who had done what and why this was systematically constructed to serve Stalin's current political needs. The October Revolution was presented as substantially the work of Stalin, with Lenin as the visionary leader, but Stalin as the indispensable organizing force. Trotsky was mentioned only as a negative figure, a wrecker, an agent of foreign powers, a saboteur of the revolutionary project. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin appeared only in their roles as opponents of the correct Leninist-Stalinist line. The entire history of the party's internal debates, the rich, complex, genuinely important disagreements about strategy and theory that had characterized the early Soviet period, was reduced to a simple narrative. There was the correct line, and there were the enemies who opposed it. The short course was, within months of its publication, the most widely distributed book in the Soviet Union. It was mandatory reading in every party organization, every educational institution, every workplace study group. It was translated into every language spoken within the Soviet Union's borders and a large number of languages spoken outside them. It was, for the next 15 years until Stalin's death in 1953, the foundational document of Soviet historical understanding. Any historian, any teacher, any journalist who needed to write about the history of the party wrote in accordance with the short course. Any account that deviated from the short course was not just wrong, it was counter-revolutionary. The short course was, in effect, the encyclopedia's replacement pages elevated to the level of a complete historical system. It did not merely update specific entries. It provided a complete, coherent, internally consistent narrative of the Soviet past, in which Stalin was the central figure. His opponents were criminals and enemies, and the path from the revolution to the present was a continuous, progressive, correct line of development under correct leadership. Robert Tucker, one of the most important Western biographers of Stalin, called the short course the Stalinist Bible. The comparison is apt in a specific way, like a religious text. The short course was not primarily a source of information. It was a normative framework, a text that told you not just what had happened, but what the past meant, and what attitude you were required to take toward it. Reading it was not an act of learning. It was an act of political alignment. The implications for education were profound and lasting. Soviet children who received their historical education during the Stalin era learned history from textbooks that were directly derived from the short course. They learned about a revolution in which Stalin had been central. They learned about a civil war in which Stalin's military genius had been decisive. They learned about a party leadership in which all deviations from the correct Leninist-Stalinist line had been the work of foreign agents and class enemies. They learned, in other words, a history that was both coherent and systematically false. A history designed not to explain the past but to legitimate the present. Here is the problem this created, and it is a problem that did not resolve when Stalin died. A historical falsification can be corrected in principle. You can find the original sources, compare them to the official account, identify the discrepancies, and publish a corrected version. This is what historians do, and Soviet archives have been extensively worked through by historians since the partial opening of the 1990s. The historical record, insofar as the documents survive, can be reconstructed, but a generation educated on a falsified history does not simply update when the correction is published. The falsified history is not just a set of propositions that can be replaced by accurate propositions. It is a cognitive framework, a way of understanding the structure of the past that shapes how new information is processed, what feels plausible and what feels unlikely, what kinds of questions get asked and what kinds don't. A Soviet historian trained in the short course framework is not just missing specific facts. Their entire analytical apparatus has been shaped by a falsified model of how the revolution worked, who the important actors were, what the significant conflicts were about. This is why the de-Stalinization process that began under Khrushchev in 1956, when the famous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress acknowledged, for the first time in official Soviet discourse, that Stalin had committed crimes and that the official history of his leadership had been falsified, was so psychologically and politically traumatic for the Soviet Party and its supporters worldwide. It was not simply an update of the factual record. It was an announcement that the cognitive framework on which an entire generation's understanding of reality was based was wrong. Not partially wrong, not slightly mistaken, but systematically, deliberately, comprehensively wrong. The response to this announcement is instructive. Some people updated. Some people, particularly the younger generation, found in the secret speech a liberation, a permission to think about history in ways that the falsified framework had made impossible. Some people denied it, or qualified it to the point of practical denial, because accepting it fully meant accepting that everything you had been told, everything you had repeated, every act of public performance of the official history in which you had participated, had been false. And that is a very heavy weight to carry, especially when you had, in many cases, repeated the official history in contexts where your disagreement with it might have endangered others, and some people a number impossible to quantify, but real had known, privately, all along. They had looked at the manipulated photographs and recognized the manipulation. They had received the encyclopedia replacement pages and understood what the razor blade was for. They had read the short course and recognized the gap between its account and what they personally remembered or had heard from people who had been there. They had held this knowledge privately, silently, for years, because the costs of saying it publicly had been too high. And when Khrushchev said it publicly, from the podium of the Party Congress, they experienced something that was not quite surprise, something closer to the particular complicated feeling of hearing confirmed, officially, what you have privately known for a long time but been afraid to say. There is a letter in the archives of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, recovered by historians after the partial opening of Soviet archives, from a rank-and-file party member to the Central Committee, written in 1,956 inches the weeks after the secret speech. The letter is not from a dissident or an intellectual. It is from an ordinary party member, a factory worker in Leningrad, who had been a member of the party for more than 20 years. He writes that he had, over the course of those 20 years, received many encyclopedia replacement pages. He had cut out the pages as instructed. He had inserted the replacements. He had said nothing. He writes, "I always knew, when the new pages came, what they meant. But what was I supposed to do? I did what was required. Now I would like to know, will someone tell us? Finally, how what was true, not what we are required to say. What was true?" That question, what was true, is the question that the Soviet project of historical falsification had spent 30 years making it impossible to ask in public. The razor blade and the replacement page had not convinced the factory worker in Leningrad that Beria had always been a geographic feature of the Arctic Ocean. They had simply ensured that he kept his knowledge private, performed the required ignorance, and cut out the pages. The pages were cut out. The truth remained, somewhere, but finding it reassembling the actual record from the fragments that survived the erasure, the retouching, the replacement pages, the burned books. The purged archives was the work of decades, and in some respects it is work that continues today. The Soviet project of historical falsification was thorough. It was not total, but the damage it did to the archive, to the collective memory, to the social capacity to distinguish reliable from manipulated knowledge, is damage that Soviet successor states are still working through. The encyclopedia replacement pages are sitting in libraries, correctly filed, completely wrong. The short course is in university collections, completely readable, systematically false. The photographs are in archives, carefully retouched, visibly absent, where people used to stand, and somewhere in the Leningrad city records, there is probably still a building where a large official portrait of Zinoviev was painted over in the 1930s. The wall is clean. The history is not. Stalin died on March 5. He died in his dacha at Kuntsevo, outside Moscow. After suffering a massive stroke 4 days earlier, he was 73 years old. He had ruled the Soviet Union for approximately 25 years. In those 25 years, by the most conservative scholarly estimates, I've been directly responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 6 and 9 million people through executions, deliberate famine, and the Gulag system. Other estimates go considerably higher. The range of scholarly opinion on the total death toll of Stalinism is wide from roughly 6 million at the low end to 20 million or more at the high end, and the width of that range is itself a consequence of the subject of this episode. The systematic destruction of records makes precise accounting impossible. When you erase the evidence that people existed, you also erase the evidence of what happened to them. He died, reportedly, in the presence of his terrified subordinates, Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Bulganin men who had spent years performing devotion to him and who now stood around his dying body uncertain whether to call a doctor, because calling a doctor too soon might look like disloyalty, and calling one too late might look like negligence. And in the Soviet system, both of those could be fatal. The story of the hours between Stalin's stroke and the arrival of medical help, a period of something like 12 hours, during which the most powerful man in the Soviet Union lay on the floor of his dacha, while his subordinates deliberated about protocol, is one of the more darkly comic footnotes to the entire Stalinist period. The system had so thoroughly terrorized everyone in it that even the death of the man at its center required careful political navigation. After Stalin died, a question presented itself to the Soviet leadership with the force of an emergency. What do you do with the cult? The cult of personality, the official deification of Stalin that had been built up over decades. Through the photographs and the textbooks and the encyclopedias and the short course and the enormous portraits and the renamed cities and the constant invocation of Stalin's wisdom in every domain of Soviet public life was not simply a propaganda apparatus. It was 1953, the structural foundation of Soviet political legitimacy. The authority of the Soviet state rested, in significant measure, on the authority of Stalin. Remove Stalin from the center, and the entire edifice of legitimacy required reconstruction. The people who succeeded Stalin, who spent approximately 3 years in a collective leadership arrangement before Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the dominant figure, understood this. They also understood something else, that the cult was a liability as well as an asset. The cult required them to maintain, in public, a set of historical claims that they privately knew to be false. It required them to defend the show trials, which they knew to have been staged. It required them to defend the mass arrests, which had consumed a significant number of their own colleagues, subordinates, and family members. And it required them to defend the official history, the short course, the encyclopedia entries, the manipulated photographs that they knew from their own experience to be a fabrication. The tension between the legacy and the knowledge of the legacy was unsustainable. Something had to give. What gave in the most dramatic single moment of the post-Stalin political transition was Khrushchev's so-called secret speech on February 25, 1956, at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev addressed the assembled delegates in a closed session. No foreign delegations, no press, no official transcript for public distribution. He spoke for approximately 4 hours. What he said was, by the standards of official Soviet discourse, unprecedented. He described Stalin's crimes. He described the falsified show trials. He described the mass executions of loyal party members on fabricated charges. He described the torture of confessions. He described the destruction of the Red Army Officer Corps before the German invasion, a decision that had contributed directly to the catastrophic Soviet losses of 1,941 and 1,942. He described, with specific examples and named victims, the machinery of terror that had operated under Stalin's personal direction for 2 decades. He did not describe everything. He did not discuss the deliberate famine that had killed millions of Ukrainian peasants in 1932 to 1933. He did not fully account for the death toll of collectivization. He did not address the Gulag in comprehensive terms. His account was selective, shaped by the political need to indict Stalin without indicting the entire party, including the men sitting in the room, several of whom had personally signed death lists during the terror. The secret speech was not a full accounting. It was a managed partial disclosure, calibrated to achieve specific political ends. But even as a partial disclosure, it was seismic. The speech was supposed to be secret. It was not secret for long. The CIA obtained a copy within weeks, reportedly through Israeli intelligence, which had received it from a source within the Polish Communist Party, which had been provided a copy because Poland was a Soviet satellite, whose leadership needed to be managed through the transition. The CIA provided the text to the New York Times, which published it in June 1956. By that point, the text had already circulated widely within communist parties worldwide, producing precisely the crisis of faith that the Soviet leadership had hoped to manage. Mass resignations from communist parties in Western Europe, traumatic internal debates in every country where the party had been a significant force, and within the Soviet Union itself a slow, uneven, deeply contested process of what Khrushchev called de-Stalinization. De-Stalinization meant, among other things, the partial undoing of the Erasure project. The people who had been removed from the photographic record, expelled from the encyclopedias, edited out of the official history, some of them were now officially rehabilitated. Not all of them. The process was incomplete, contradictory, and driven by political calculation rather than historical honesty. Trotsky, for example, was never rehabilitated in the Soviet period. He remained an official enemy, because acknowledging his actual role in the revolution would have required too fundamental a reconstruction of the founding narrative. Bukharin was partially rehabilitated. His reputation was restored in the late 1980s. Under Gorbachev, not under Khrushchev. The victims of the Gulag who were still alive were released gradually over the late 1950s and early 1960s, but they were released into a society that was not prepared to hear their stories. And many of them maintained silence about their experiences for the rest of their lives. What de-Stalinization did do, partially and imperfectly, was create a space cautious, surveilled, with clear limits in which the gap between official history and actual history could be acknowledged, not in full, not in public, not without consequences, but in ways that had been entirely impossible during the Stalin years. The literary thaw of the late 1950s and early 1960s produced works Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, published with Khrushchev's personal approval in 1962, being the most famous that described the realities of the Gulag in terms that the official history had denied. They were published within limits, distributed within limits, discussed within limits, but they were published. The limits themselves were a measure of how far the Soviet system still was from honest reckoning, but the existence of the space was a measure of how far it had moved from the total falsification of the Stalin years. The photographs, however, are a separate and instructive case. After Stalin's death, the manipulated photographs did not simply disappear or get corrected. They remained in circulation in archives, in published books, in newspapers' photographic libraries, alongside whatever original versions had survived. The question of what to do with them was navigated differently in different institutional contexts and at different moments. In some cases, original versions were quietly reintroduced into circulation, with no acknowledgement that retouched versions had existed. In some cases, the retouched versions remained, the only ones available, because the originals had been destroyed or were inaccessible. In some cases, and this is the most revealing, both versions coexisted in the same archive, filed without comment, leaving researchers to navigate the question of which was real, without institutional guidance. This is not merely an archival inconvenience. It is a symptom of a deeper problem. The Soviet project of historical falsification had not simply produced false records. It had produced a situation in which the relationship between the official record and actual events was structurally unclear, in which every document, every photograph, every official text carried a question mark that could only be resolved by cross-referencing against other sources, many of which had been subject to the same process of revision. For Soviet historians working in the post-Stalin period, and especially for the historians who flooded into the Soviet archives after Gorbachev's glasnost reforms of the late 1980s and the partial opening of archives after 1991, this created a methodological challenge unlike anything that historians and most other national traditions face. The question was not simply, what does this document say? The question was, has this document been altered? And if so, what did it say before it was altered? And is the original version recoverable? Every Soviet source required a layer of source criticism that went beyond the normal scholarly evaluation of reliability and bias. It required asking whether the source had been fabricated. The scholars who did this work, and there are many of them, working in archives in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kyiv, and a dozen other cities, describe an experience that is simultaneously exhilarating and disorienting. Exhilarating because the archives contain an enormous quantity, the primary documentation of one of the most consequential political experiments in human history. Disorienting because the relationship between the documents and the events they purport to describe is constantly in question. You hold a letter, a memorandum, a photograph, and you know, or you should know, that it may have been altered. It may be a replacement page. It may be a retouched image. The document in your hands may be a lie that has been organized to look like evidence. This is not a theoretical concern. There are documented cases of Soviet archival documents that were altered after the fact. Minutes of meetings changed to remove the names of participants, who were later purged, or reports updated to match the current official line. Files on individuals edited to construct the paper trail that a subsequent prosecution required. The archive is not clean. It reflects the system that produced it. And yet, the archive also contains, in abundance, the evidence that contradicts the official history. The letters that weren't destroyed, the original photographs that survived because someone kept a copy in a private drawer, the memos that were filed before the purge reached the filer, The testimony of survivors recorded in the 1950s and 1960s as the Gulag released its survivors that exists in contradictions with official records. The historical record is damaged, but it is not destroyed. The erasure was thorough, but it was not total. And the reason it was not total is, in its way, one of the most important stories within the larger story of Soviet falsification. The erasure was not total because people kept things. This sounds simple and perhaps obvious, but it is important to understand what it meant. In practical terms, to keep something in Stalin's Soviet Union, to keep a photograph that showed a purged person, to keep a letter from someone who had been arrested, to keep a copy of a document that contradicted the official history. These were not neutral acts of sentimentality. They were potentially acts of political risk because possession of materials featuring enemies of the people could be construed as sympathy with those enemies, which was itself a crime. And yet people kept things. They kept photographs in the back of drawers, under floorboards, sewn into the lining of clothing. They kept letters in spaces that were unlikely to be searched. They kept, in private memory, the testimonies of what they had seen, keeping them there because writing them down was too dangerous, but determined not to let them be lost. The entire practice of what became known as samizdat, the self-publishing underground by which dissident literature circulated in typescript copies throughout the Soviet Union from the late 1950s onward, rested on Evli, the same impulse, the determination of individuals to preserve and circulate information that the state had decided should not exist. The people who kept things were not, for the most part, heroes in any dramatic sense. They were ordinary people making private decisions about what risk they were willing to accept in order to preserve what they knew. Some of them were found out. Some of them paid for their choices, with imprisonment or worse. Most of them were not found out because the state, for all its surveillance apparatus, could not monitor every drawer in every apartment in a country that spanned 11 time zones. The private space was never fully colonized, even at the height of the terror. And in that private space, inadequate, dangerous, fragmented, the actual record survived. The philosopher and historian Timothy Snyder has written about what he calls the politics of eternity, the tendency of authoritarian regimes to construct a political culture based on the perpetual return to a mythologized past rather than the acknowledgement of an actual history. The Soviet project of historical falsification is one of the clearest examples of this politics of eternity ever produced. A systematic attempt to replace the actual past with a mythological narrative in which the regime had always been right. Its enemies had always been wrong. And the present moment was the culmination of an unbroken correct development. The problem with the politics of eternity and the reason that the Soviet project ultimately failed in its most ambitious aims is that the people living under it do not share the regime's relationship to time. For the regime, and the past is a resource to be managed. For the people living in it, the past is a lived experience, something they have in their bodies and their memories, not just in the official documents. You cannot airbrush a person out of a photograph and expect the people who worked with that person for 20 years to forget that they existed. You cannot send a replacement page for the Encyclopedia entry on Beria and expect the people who attended meetings with Beria, who received orders from Beria, whose colleagues were arrested on Beria's authority, to experience his replacement by a geographical feature as a satisfactory account of their own history. The Soviet falsification project created an enormous, permanent gap between official knowledge and private knowledge. This gap was one of the defining features of Soviet social life, the thing that made the peculiar social performance of the Stalin era possible, and that made it so exhausting. Everyone was required, in public, to perform a relationship to the official history that most people privately knew to be false. The performance was mandatory, The gap between performance and private knowledge was also mandatory. There was no legitimate public space in which the gap could be acknowledged. The result was a society in which, as Orlando Figes documents in extraordinary detail in The Whisperers, a large portion of the population had internalized a permanent bifurcation between public and private self, a professional, social, political persona that performed the required relationship to official history, and a private self that held the actual memories, the actual knowledge, the actual grief. This bifurcation had effects that went far beyond the specific question of historical accuracy. It shaped the entire culture of interpersonal trust in Soviet society. If you cannot say publicly what you privately know about history, you also cannot say publicly what you privately think about politics, or economics, or the performance of the leadership, or the condition of your own life. The habit of public performance and private knowledge generalizes. It produces a culture in which the public sphere is a theater, a space of mandatory performance rather than genuine communication, and in which real communication retreats into the private, the whispered, the carefully calibrated conversation with people you trust enough to risk saying what you actually think. That culture did not end with Stalin. It did not end with de-Stalinization. It did not end with Khrushchev or Brezhnev or Gorbachev. The social habits produced by decades of mandatory public falsification are not dissolved by a change in political leadership. They are encoded in the practices and expectations of daily life in ways that take generations to shift. The scholars who have studied post-Soviet societies, particularly the sociologist Alexei Yurchak, whose book Everything Was Forever, Until It Was No More is the most precise analysis of the late Soviet social world, describe a culture that had, be the Brezhnev era, achieved a kind of stable accommodation with the gap between official and private. People knew the official history was false. Everyone knew that. Everyone knew it was false. The performance of official history had become, by the 1970s, a kind of ritual. Something you did because it was required, not because anyone believed it, and with a kind of collective understanding that the requirement was separate from the question of truth. The ideology had become, in Yurchak's analysis, simultaneously ubiquitous and meaningless everywhere, in every official speech and document and visual display, and utterly emptied of content by decades of performed compliance. This is one of the more important lessons of the Soviet falsification project, and one that tends to get overlooked in accounts that focus primarily on the perpetrators and the mechanics. Systematic official falsification does not, in the end, primarily create a population of true believers. It creates a population that has learned to perform belief, and a population that has learned to perform belief has lost something important, not just access to accurate information, but the habit of treating the public sphere as a space where truth and falsehood are meaningfully distinct. The public sphere becomes a performance space, and in a performance space, the question "is this true?" loses its urgency, because everyone already knows that the answer to that question is not what determines what gets said. Now let's turn to the larger world, because the Soviet project of visual and historical falsification was not unique. It was extreme in its scale, its ambition, and its systematic organization. But the impulse, it expressed the desire to control the visual and written record, to shape what posterity would understand about the present, is not a Soviet invention. It is a feature of political power. Wherever political power exists and has access to the means of image production, China, under the Mao era, produced its own extensive photographic manipulation. The removals and replacements that accompanied the Cultural Revolution's successive waves of denunciation, in which figures who had been prominent in one campaign found themselves erased from the visual record when they became the targets of the next. The photograph of the Gang of Four trial, in which Mao's widow, Jiang Qing, and her co-defendants appeared in official documentation, underwent its own series of manipulations as the political status of the figures involved shifted in the years after Mao's death. North Korea, whose cult of the Kim dynasty represents perhaps the most thorough current practitioner of the Soviet political aesthetic, has produced official photographs of stately meetings and military inspections in which the number of people present, the identity of specific figures, and the apparent evidence of various activities have been adjusted to serve the current political narrative with a consistency that researchers have documented extensively. These are the systems that acknowledge their lineage most clearly. But the practice extends well beyond formally totalitarian states. Every government that has ever issued an official photograph has made choices about what that photograph includes and excludes. Every state that has maintained an official archive has made choices about what is preserved and what is not. Every government that has commissioned an official history has made choices about what interpretive framework that history applies, and whose contributions it emphasizes, and whose it minimizes. These are not Soviet practices. They are the ordinary practices of power and its relationship to the record. The Soviet contribution was not the impulse. It was the systematic organization of the impulse into a comprehensive, bureaucratized, industrially scaled program. The Soviet contribution was the retouching department, the workforce. From the procedures, the quality standards for erasure. The Soviet contribution was the replacement page, the institutional mechanism for ensuring that the revision was distributed to every copy. In every library, in every home where the encyclopedia sat on the shelf, the Soviet contribution was the short course, the single, authoritative, mandatory text that unified all of official history into a single coherent false narrative, distributed to every school, every workplace, every party cell in the country. The Soviet contribution was the demonstration that this was possible, that a state with sufficient control over the production and distribution of knowledge could, in fact, substantially control what the official record said about the past, that photographs could be manipulated at scale, that encyclopedias could be updated through the post, that history textbooks could be rewritten to serve current political needs, and that the rewritten versions could be distributed so thoroughly that the original versions became inaccessible to most people. This had not been done before. At this scale, with this thoroughness, the Soviet Union showed that it could be done, and the demonstration mattered, because demonstrations always matter in the history of political technology. Which brings us, inevitably, to the present. We are living in the most photographed moment in human history. More photographs are taken every day in the current era than were taken in the entire first century of photography. Every person with a smartphone is a photographer. Every event of any significance, and many events of no significance at all, is documented in images that are distributed within seconds to audiences of potentially millions. The photograph, which in the Soviet era was a scarce, controlled, institutionally produced artifact, is now something closer to the ambient texture of daily life, everywhere, constant, taken for granted, and the tools for manipulating photographs have never been easier to use, more powerful, or more accessible. The airbrush, in skilled hands, could produce a convincing removal after hours of careful work. Photoshop can produce the same result in minutes. The deepfake algorithms that have been developed in the past decade can produce not just still images but video footage of people saying and doing things they never said or did, with a quality that is becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from authentic footage by casual visual inspection. The technical barrier to the kind of manipulation that the Soviet retouchers labored over for days has been reduced, in the space of roughly 30 years, from a skilled professional operation to something that requires no professional skill at all, and in some cases, no human intervention. This is not, to be clear, a straightforward recapitulation of the Soviet situation. The Soviet state controlled the production and distribution of official images because it controlled the entire media system. There were no competing sources of images. No independent photographers whose work might contradict the official record. No internet on which original versions of manipulated photographs could be circulated. The current environment is almost exactly the opposite. An enormous abundance of competing images, source, perspective, and versions, distributed through a global network that no single state controls. The Soviet problem was an information desert. The current problem is an information flood. But the flood creates its own version of the Soviet problem. In a world where any image might be manipulated, where deepfakes are increasingly indistinguishable from authentic footage, where the tools for producing convincing false images are freely available to anyone with a laptop in this world, the epistemological situation of the ordinary person is, in some important ways, structurally similar to the situation of the Soviet citizen looking at a retouched photograph. The question is not, is this image authentic? And you might never be certain of the answer. The question is whether you have reliable ways of determining which images to trust, and whether the institutions that might help you answer that question are themselves trustworthy. In the Soviet case, the institutional answer was clear. The official institutions were not trustworthy. And private knowledge, fragmented and dangerous as it was a better guide to reality than the official record. In the current case, the answer is less clear, because the institutions are not monolithically controlled by a single political authority. And the flooding of the information environment with competing claims and competing images makes it genuinely difficult to know which sources to weight and how. This is not the same problem, but it is a problem that sits in the same neighborhood, the neighborhood of epistemological uncertainty, where the reliable relationship between images and events cannot be taken for granted. The Soviet falsification project ended partially, imperfectly, with enormous amounts of damage still unrepaired. When the political system that had produced it collapsed, the encyclopedias still sit in libraries, some with replacement pages intact. The retouched photographs are still in archives. The short course is still findable in any decent academic library as a monument to a specific kind of political ambition. They are there as evidence of what was done, by whom, in service of what goals, with what consequences. The people who were erased from those photographs: Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Yezhov, and the thousands of less famous figures who were removed from group photographs and official records across the Soviet Union are, most of them, at least partially restored to the historical record. The scholarly literature has recovered their actual roles, corrected the falsified accounts, and produced what is now, for most of the major figures, a reasonably accurate picture of the actual history. Trotsky's role in the revolution and the Civil War is documented. Bukharin's theoretical contributions are acknowledged. The victims of the show trials have been formally rehabilitated by Russian courts. In most cases, decades after their deaths, the restoration is real, but it is incomplete. The thousands of lesser figures, the regional party officials, the factory managers, the military officers, the ordinary citizens who were arrested, executed, and removed from whatever photographs they appeared in, most of them do not have biographers. Most of them do not have the detailed scholarly attention that Trotsky or Bukharin received. They were removed from the photographs. Their names were removed from the records. And for many of them, the evidence of their existence is fragmentary enough that a full recovery of their histories is simply not possible. The damage to those specific records is permanent. This is the cost of Systematic erasure that tends to get lost in the larger narrative. The big names survive, in some form, because their prominence before their erasure was sufficient to leave traces that the erasure couldn't fully reach foreign publications. Exile writings, the recollections of people who had worked with them in contexts that the Soviet archive didn't cover. The small names are more vulnerable. The minor official photographed at a party conference in 1932, removed from the image in 1937, when someone at the table beside him was arrested. Replaced by a painted section of wall, that person may be genuinely irrecoverable. Their existence is a gap in a photograph. Their history is a space where something used to be. There is a passage in David King's The Commissar Vanishes, the book that, more than any other, has brought Soviet photo manipulation to wide attention that captures this with unusual precision. King describes examining a photograph of a Soviet agricultural delegation from the mid-1930s, in which 3 of the 9 people depicted have been removed. He knows, from other sources, who 2 of the removed figures were. The third is unidentified. The retouching over that figure is thorough. The background reconstruction is careful. The figure is entirely gone, and King notes that he has not been able to identify who this person was. They were at a delegation meeting. They were photographed. They were removed. And their name, the specific details of their life and their fate, may simply not be recoverable. He describes this as the anonymous victim, the person whose erasure was so thorough that the question of who they were cannot, from the available evidence, not be answered. The photograph contains the space where they stood. It does not contain them. This is the most extreme version of the Soviet falsification project's success, not merely the suppression of inconvenient information, not merely the management of the official record, but the actual, permanent, irreversible destruction of the evidence that a specific person existed, not the suppression of their political inconvenience, the erasure of their humanity, the reduction of a life with its specific texture, its specific experiences, its specific griefs and relationships and contributions to a gap in a photograph. And this is why the canal photograph, with its empty stretch of bank where Nikolai Yezhov used to stand, is something more than a symbol of Soviet propaganda. It is a specific, irreducible reminder that photographs are not just evidence of political positions or ideological conflicts. They are evidence of presence. They say, this person was here, this specific body, in this specific place, at this specific moment. Whatever else may be disputed, whatever the politics, whatever the ideology, whatever the subsequent history, this person was here. The photograph says so. The retoucher's job was to make the photograph unsay it. And the reason the canal photograph has survived, the reason it circulates as an image of the practice and the problem, is that the original version also survived. Someone had a copy. Somewhere. In the years between the retouching and the partial opening of the Soviet archives, someone kept the original. It existed in a drawer, or a private collection, or a foreign archive, or a library outside the reach of the Soviet retouching apparatus, and eventually, it became available for comparison. And the comparison tells the story that the retoucher was paid to prevent. This person was here. This is the entire argument of the preservation of truth. Reduced to its simplest form, you cannot prevent people from keeping things. You can make it dangerous and difficult and, in individual cases, impossible, but across a large enough population, over a long enough time. The determination to keep what you know, to not surrender the evidence of your own experience to the official revision, is more durable than the revision itself. The Soviet state retouched thousands of photographs. Some of those photographs survive in both versions. Because people kept originals, Because the archive was never fully under control. Because the drawer was never fully visible to the censor. Yezhov was painted out of the canal photograph with considerable professional skill. He was given, in 1940, what he had spent 3 years arranging for others, erasure from the visual record, followed by physical erasure from the world. The man who had personally supervised the removal of 750 people from existence was himself removed. The canal bank was just a canal bank. His name was classified. His files were sealed. His role in the terror was officially unacknowledged for decades. But someone, at some point, kept the original photograph. And the original photograph says he was there, standing by the water, smiling, apparently. In the particular way that people smile in official photographs, the smile that is a social performance rather than an expression of feeling. Standing beside the man who had already decided to destroy him, on a day when he may not yet have known that the decision had been made. An ordinary moment of official photography. At the opening of a canal, on an ordinary Soviet afternoon. He was there. The photograph says so. The photograph that someone kept in some drawer, somewhere, against the instructions of the state that photograph says so. And that is the only reason we know. In the end, this is what the history of Soviet photo manipulation teaches. At its most fundamental level, not about photography, not about propaganda, not about the specific political struggles of the Stalinist period, but about the relationship between power and truth. Power can organize the production of false records with extraordinary efficiency. Power can distribute the false records through every institutional channel it controls. Power can make the false records the only version that most people can access. For years or decades, power can make the performance of belief in the false records mandatory, and back that mandate with lethal consequences for non-compliance. But power cannot reach everywhere. It cannot see every drawer. It cannot audit every private archive. It cannot monitor every act of quiet, private, unglamorous preservation, the decision to keep a photograph, to remember a name, to tell a child what actually happened. The private record is distributed, fragmented, vulnerable, and often damaged. But it is also, in a sense, that the official record is not honest. It records what actually happened in the imperfect way that human memory and private documentation always record things. It is incomplete. It is biased. It is shaped by the particular perspective of the particular person doing the preserving. But it is not, at its core, organized around a lie. And when it survives, when it can be compared against the official version, the comparison is devastating. The empty canal bank is devastating. Not because of what it shows, because of what it doesn't show and what the original photograph shows that the retouched one doesn't. The person who kept the original gave the world not just a document, but an argument that the official version is not the only version, that the blank space was not always blank, that something was there. Before the airbrush and the instruction and the careful professional work of making it seem like nothing had ever been there at all. The photo where someone used to stand is a lesson in power. The original photo, the one with the person still in it, is a lesson in its limits. History, in the end, is a competition between those two photographs, and the competition is not over.